You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 25. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Chris Sims. On today's show, we talk to Dr. Dan Bigman about ground-penetrating radar and some other geophysical tools. Dan has a company that does this for archaeological projects and other clients based in the southeastern United States. Stick around to the end for a very special offer that's only open to APM listeners. Let's get to the show. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me after it's only one episode, but it's like a 1 month hiatus. Chris, how's it going?
Great. I'm reporting from New Zealand, soon to be back in the States, and it's good to be back.
Yeah, and I have noticed, and this is sort of ironic to say, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but there is a slight lag sometimes when you talk and when we respond, so we might be talking over each other. And it's funny that there's a lag because you're actually like 21 hours in the future right now for me. So, I don't know.
Speaking back in time.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what we're all about is science here.
Yeah, that's what New Zealand is known for, right?
No, I meant Archaeotech.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, we don't want to put anything on New Zealand. It's too much pressure. Okay, well, now that we've just lost our one other New Zealand listener, let's bring on Mr. Dan Bigman. Actually, Dr. Dan Bigman. Sorry. I met Dan at UGA when I was there. We were in very different programs, but that's where we met. And Dan, how's it going?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into what we're going to talk about.
Okay, so I got into archaeology. I sort of stumbled into it. I had no idea that there were as many archaeologists out there as there are. I thought there was a handful of archaeologists in the world. And when I went back to school, undergraduate, I went to Lehman College in the Bronx in New York. And I said, I was a little bit older, and I said, I'm going to try to do it right and take as many different classes as I can and really try to figure out what I want. Mm-hmm. I ended up in this archaeology class called Ancient Peoples and Cultures, and I fell in love with the course, and I fell in love with the teacher. He was just super exciting to listen to, 3 times a week. And I came home one day and I said to my wife, I said, I want to do what this guy does. I just, that was it. I was in a sociology class too. I didn't want to do what that woman did. I was in a couple other classes. I didn't want to do what they did. But in the archaeology class, I just kind of clicked, and so it was out of nowhere sort of for me. And then I came to Georgia, right? So from New York, came to Georgia specifically to go to UGA to work with my advisor, who was Steve Kovaleski. And initially, I had anticipated working in Mexico, where he did the majority of his career, and doing large-scale, full-coverage regional surveys, which are critical to archaeology, with him down there. And I moved to Georgia, and I took an Archaeology of Georgia class. I took a geophysics class, and I walked into his office one day, and I said, would it be okay if I changed my focus and worked in Georgia and did geophysics? And I was really lucky to have him as my advisor because he was just, he was very understanding and warm about it and encouraged me to pursue what was interesting to me. And he was such an amazing advisor. He was able to stay on as my advisor, even though it wasn't necessarily his focus. But because he's such a scholar, he can speak to so many different things that he was able to still organize what I think turned out to be a pretty good project. And so that's how I made it down to Georgia, and I ended up staying in Georgia. I said, well, I can sort of work in my backyard. There was really cool archaeology in my backyard, and equally as interesting to sort of go and learn, about. So that was sort of my pathway into archaeology, and that's where I did my degree. So I ended up getting my doctorate, like you said, at the University of Georgia, and then after that, I taught for 2 years at Georgia State University as a visiting lecturer. And when that contract was up, luckily, I think I had developed a number of skills using geophysical techniques to apply to archaeological and historic sites, that I ended up going on my own and starting a company, a consulting firm that focuses on non-invasive survey methods.
Right, and that is Bigman Geo. I keep wanting to say Big Man when I see it, but Bigman Geophysical .com, and we'll have that link in the show notes, as well as any other things we talk about today that we can put in the show notes. So check those out. I got to give a shout out to Steve too, Steve Kowaleski, because he was also on my committee when I was at UGA, and he's a great guy. You're right, really flexible and always there for you. So it was good working with him.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to talk about a number of things. One of the things we talked about setting this up, though, was ground penetrating radar. And I know ground penetrating radar to me is one of those things that always seems like a little bit of magic to people, and it's always very flashy because of the equipment and things like that. I mean, you go to big conferences like the SAAs, like the one coming up here in Orlando, and there's always the GPR guys that are there, and they've got all the big fancy equipment. They've got the biggest booths. You can just drag these things around in their fancy carts. So, what is ground penetrating radar for those that don't know? Let's just start with that, the basics.
Okay, so the way that ground penetrating radar works is it's primarily an antenna that you drag across the ground surface, typically. I mean, there are other ways to utilize it, but generally for archaeology, you drag this antenna across the ground surface, and it's a pair of antenna. It's a transmission and a receiver. And so the transmitting antenna will produce an electromagnetic pulse, a radio wave that gets pushed into the ground, and that travels through the subsurface. And the speed that it travels depends on the medium that it's traveling through, right? So whether it's clay or sand, it's going to affect how fast the wave travels through the subsurface. Whenever the wave encounters some sort of discontinuity in its speed, right? So when it changes speed, some of the wavefront's energy is reflected back to the surface, and that's recorded with the receiver antenna. And so the receiver antenna will record the two-way travel time of that wave. So it'll tell you, how long it took for it to reflect off some discontinuity, and how dramatic, right, that reflection was, record the amplitude. And the amplitude is going to be based on how different the change in speed was, right, which is really related to how different the materials are. So if you go from dry sand to a little bit wet sand, there may be a reflection, but it's going to be very low amplitude. If you go from dry sand to metal, it's going to be a really dramatic difference in the materials, and that's going to produce a much higher amplitude reflection. And then the unique thing about GPR is it's the ability, since you can record the two-way travel time, and if you know the wave speed, you can convert the two-way travel time into depth. And so that's basically how it works, as sort of simple as I can, make it. And so it's one of the only true kind of three-dimensional data sets, it produces one of the only true three-dimensional data sets for any geophysical, technique.
So I'm wondering, using your example of going through dry sand and hitting wet sand and getting a weak return on that, are there archaeological materials that actually are things that would give you what would look like sort of a false positive like that, but is actually something, and you just can't really tell with GPR, or maybe you have to be really good at it? I don't know. But are there some objects that can give that kind of return?
You mean like a low amplitude return?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you think about this, think about archaeology, think about Mesoamerica, because here's one area that sometimes seems to struggle with some of the geophysics because the architecture was produced out of the same material that the host soil matrix was made out of. So
Right.
Some of these karstic areas, like in the Yucatan, for example, they're cutting out limestone, and they're creating these limestone. However, it's sort of embedded in a reasonably high limestone rich soil, and so when it goes from limestone to limestone, the amplitude might be pretty small, even though the compaction is going to be different, right? A sort of limestone cut block is going to have slightly different properties than limestone-based, karstic-based soil. However, the materials are not that different from each other, right? Other than compaction. So sometimes what you'll get is a weak reflection or no reflection if the dielectric properties, if the physical properties are not all that different, you could struggle to identify that. Another limitation or another way that sort of you can, completely miss an object is as the wave comes out of the antenna, it comes out as a cone. It kind of spreads with depth. And if you're hitting an object, a floor that, let's say, it's buried, but it's slumped on one side, and so the orientation of it isn't directly back towards the surface, it's possible that by the time the wave reflects off that oblique angle, the wave gets reflected, away from the antenna itself, and so you may actually miss it, right? You might not see it. So there are definitely times that can happen. And then on the flip side, and this happens all the time, is you get non-archaeological materials that present themselves as archaeological features.
Right.
And so you might be in a cemetery trying to find, it's a historic cemetery certainly, trying to find old burials, historic burials, but a bioturbation might mask as a burial.
Okay.
Right, or something like that. So you definitely do get sometimes reflections that could be very difficult to interpret, and I do think a lot of that comes with the ability to interpret it comes with experience.
Now, speaking of interpretation, I was wondering about that too. Now, two things. One, are you looking at these the raw data as this thing is? Do you drag this thing across the ground and then go back to your office or whatever, download the data and look at it, or can you look at this as it's being created?
You can look at it as it's being created. It's not always ideal to do that, but in the private sector, sometimes you're limited, by time constraints. Sometimes you're limited by money and other resources, and sometimes then you're doing real time interpretations and marking burials, for example. And certainly it's easier to do if you have a cemetery that's not all that old and that has intact coffins. Sometimes it's easier. You see sort of pattern reflections. They're systematic. They're all the same depth. And you can see those over and over, and then you can make those interpretations really on the fly. But to do the job right, you really should go back to software on the computer, go back to the lab and do some post-processing, because a lot of times you'll miss something or something flagged in the field. You might go back and process your data and find that, well, it actually doesn't present like the rest of these reflections do, and it probably is not or may not be a burial, even though it might have been marked in the field. But you definitely can do real-time interpretation, and this is used, as far as real-time interpretation is concerned, all the time in civil engineering. So they'll do things like locating utilities, and they'll mark those utilities in real time. But a lot of times, those utilities have such a dramatic contrast to the host that they're in, whether it's concrete or soil. A buried utility, certainly a buried metal pipe, is going to have very clear reflection, and it's going to be long. It's going to be a certain diameter, and you're going to see that consistently over time, as you conduct the survey. And so it's certainly possible to do things like flag, these kinds of things on the fly. And sometimes in the like on projects, that's what it calls for, and that's what it dictates. And if they don't have enough, if the client doesn't have enough money for 6 days of processing, and they have money for 2 days, and they're going to start doing something in a cemetery, I think you're better off trying to do this in real time than having to go the full boat. Doing something is definitely better than doing nothing.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up software too, because that was leading into the question. We see on, take for example, you see in like a movie or something about submarines where they've got a certain return that they get back, and they know their computer crunches that out and says, oh, this is a Russian blah 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 blah. It's that kind of submarine because they've seen that return 1,000 times, and it's ID'd like that. Does the software for GPR, like if you do the post processing in the office, can the software be tuned to stuff like that and say, oh yeah, what you're returning is a metal pipe, or it is a coffin, or it is whatever you're looking for? Is it that sensitive enough, or do you still have to sit and interpret a lot of that, and just based on your experience?
You still have to sit and interpret a lot of it. Some of the things they're doing now for the software are recognizing horizons in the soil. So they'll see sort of linear patterns, and they'll be able to delineate those in the software through an algorithm, which is very helpful. In other cases, so other algorithms are being developed for, let's say, GPR also. But what it does is it basically sort of polygons the anomalies, or the reflection patterns, in like a time slice, which it would be a hard. So when you collect the data, you're collecting it as a two-dimensional profile into the ground. But if you collect a number of those side by side, then you can resample those data and actually look at it top down, and we generally call those time slices, or if you convert them to depth, it would be called depth slices. And if you have a depth slice that has linear patterns, for example, or square patterns, indicating maybe buildings or something like that, there are some softwares that have algorithms that you can run that'll sort of give you their best guesstimate as to where the geometric shapes are, and sometimes that's a good place to start. So that's coming along. I mean, and in a sense, sort of the software, or sort of the development of algorithms is becoming really helpful. But I still think you need to be able to interpret that stuff on your own. And luckily, a lot of studies have been conducted, let's say, for example, in cemeteries, where GPR has been dragged over metal coffins, wooden coffins, collapsed in grave shafts, graves with no coffin at all, graves with deteriorated wooden coffins, graves, in all sorts of different conditions. And by going over those over and over and over again, you begin to get a sense of what to expect, right? And so as you survey a cemetery, with this example, and you're seeing a bunch of potential graves, as you go back and you process the data, it's not going to tell you this looks like a metal coffin, this looks like a wooden coffin, and this looks like a collapsed-in burial. That comes with experience, that comes with doing survey, that comes with reading, other people's case studies. There's some really good resources out there, like Archaeological Prospection is one really good journal that's completely about geophysics, and Journal of Archaeological Science also produces a lot of these case studies, and seeing how people have dealt with different kinds of materials and different kinds of situations and different kind of geological conditions and different kind of civic conditions, like whether it's urban or rural. That's going to have an effect, right? The sort of background noise are going to have an effect. So taking all that into consideration, I still think that going back to the computer and looking at these things individually and trying to evaluate, what's going on as the practitioner is ultimately what should be done if it's possible to do.
Nice. Well, so now that we understand more or less the capabilities of different geophysical approaches and some of the issues that affect its use, Dan, what would you say are the biggest strengths and the biggest weaknesses for geophysics? And also, what's the best case scenario for using GPR or electromagnetometry or resistivity?
So that was like a 4-part question, Chris, and I'm going to try to remember.
I'm really bad about that.
Yeah, all those parts. But if I sort of get off track, just remind me. But strengths and weaknesses, right? The strengths of geophysics is, and there's a number of them, but number one, geophysics can produce a much larger data set generally than shovel testing surveys are going to produce, than even excavation will produce. The excavation will produce a very intensive data set where it's being conducted, but you can do a geophysical survey, or ground penetrating radar survey over a large area in very high resolution, and collect tons and tons and tons of data for, in a very short period of time. And so now that we have the capability to get this high resolution, you can in some cases see the distribution of almost all cultural resources, right? So that's a benefit, is that you can collect tons of data and you can literally map. And we've seen, some really good data sets, like the data set from Etowah in Georgia, for example, carried out primarily by the folks from University of South Carolina, Texas from San Marcos, and then Archaeogeophysical Associates, where they mapped the entire site and basically got the locations of virtually every single, what appears to be almost every single house. And they did this with a magnetometer. And they did it in a handful of weeks, right? And so that was sort of, unheard of, or couldn't even be considered prior to the development of geophysics, and with the improvement of software and hardware, right, and the actual instrumentation. So the ability to collect a ton of data in high resolution is a major advantage to this. A second advantage is that it's non-invasive, right? And where excavation is going to disturb the archaeological record, we all know archaeology is a destructive science. Once the archaeological record is disturbed, unless you write that report up properly, it's gone, right? It's gone. And so what this allows you to do is target this. I've had this debate with people. GPR, geophysics, I don't think is a replacement for, at least at this point, for excavation, right? You might have the map of an entire site, and you may have no idea when it dates to, right? Because you don't have a single artifact. So Still, traditional methods are important and critical for archaeology, but coupling geophysics with traditional methods is going to allow a significant reduction in disturbance of the archaeological record, higher rates of preservation, targeting of excavation. So when people are fighting for money and funds and and labor resources, sometimes you say, you know what, I can only do 6 2x2s and that's it. Well, if or have a very good idea of where you should go and excavate those 2x2s, as opposed to random, then your likelihood of recovery, for of targeted features or the amount of knowledge you get out of those, 6 or 8 2x2s is going to be greater, right? So it's more of like a coupling of it. But what you do get is a total preservation with just the geophysics generally, and the ability to then use that data set to target excavations, which is going to be really streamline the process for it. So I think that those are major benefits of geophysics. The drawbacks of geophysics are, like we were talking about before the show, instrumentation can be expensive. That's one problem. That's one limiting factor. I think why it's not always used all the time. Another issue is training is not ubiquitous. A lot of university campuses or many will have a course or something like that on geophysics, but many don't. And without the availability of that, students are not going to get versed in something that really is becoming as essential as something like GIS, right? So having an understanding of GIS is required for archaeology today. And geophysics is going the same way. The difference is the training is not, there's basically a GIS course on almost every single campus. There's a lot less courses being offered in geophysics, period, or for archaeologists, across the board, at least shallow geophysics, right? Near surface geophysics. So that's currently a drawback. Another issue is communication with clients. So sometimes it's difficult to communicate with clients. They saw Jurassic Park. They think that when you go over the burial, you see bones, and when you show them a hyperbola, they go, "What the hell is this?" And then you have to sort of go through a whole process of explaining it, right? So I think that archaeologists need to do a good job, a better job, myself included, at engaging with the public, managing expectations, and then sort of relaying the results in a way that is meaningful but not overpromised. And so sometimes I think this stuff either gets overpromised by the archaeologists themselves or the geophysicist, who's not an archaeologist, will overpromise, or the client or community has an expectation of what you're going to find or how it works, but it's wrong. And managing that expectation prior to the project, kind of is a stumbling block.
Right.
One final limitation, I guess I would say, and certainly are more, but one final one is that, there's variation in the quality of the data sets that are produced from geophysics. In addition to variation in the quality of the practitioner, right, of the person carrying it out, the person doing the processing, and the person doing the interpretation, there's variation in the quality of the data sets due to the sites. So not all sites are created equal, and GPR, for example, will perform differently under certain geological contexts and will perform better under certain geological contexts and perform worse under others. So, of course, me, who gets into geophysics, is in North Georgia where there's tons of clay, and clay happens to be a pretty poor medium for ground penetrating radar. It eats the signal up really quickly. The wave travels slower. So overall, the depth penetration is worse in clay. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. And people say this all the time. Oh, you can't use it in clay. That's not true. I've actually used it in clay for most of my career, and it works. So, it can always provide useful information. But if I was, in Florida where it's sand, you're going to get much better results. And so, down there for a project they did at Letchworth Love Indian Mound State Park is the name of the park. It's a very large, multi-mound, middle woodland site. We were using a GPR with a pretty low frequency that we were on top of the mound. The base was about 12 meters down, and we saw the base of the mound, right? It was like an incredible study. But then up here sometimes, I struggle to see the bottom of a grave pit that might only be, 1 meter down or 1.5 meters down because the signal's gone, by that time. So that's a limitation. I'll give you another example, of how geology can affect it. So I used a magnetometer. I did a magnetometer survey at a Civil War site in near Augusta, Georgia, called Camp Lawton, which is a pretty famous site. And it worked out really well. We found, a number of potential targets that master's students from Georgia Southern might be able to go in and do their theses on in the future, as opposed to just randomly digging. We have areas that appear to be clusters of artifacts, or areas that appear to be, buried refuse or burials. However, across the site, there's naturally occurring iron concretions, and they do have a magnetic signature. And so when we see the anomaly, a dipolar magnetic anomaly, could be that iron concretion. It could be modern metal because it's a park. It could be somebody's garbage, or it could be a Civil War artifact. And so it's tough to tell sometimes, and that can, so that's another example of a natural phenomenon that's a limiting factor, for geophysics.
Well, Dan, we're going to take a break here real quick, but I will say that archaeologists should be familiar with those geological limitations, because I also work slower in clay, and my depth penetration is typically less when I'm digging in clay. So I'll tell you, I hate it, and I'm glad I'm out in the West. But anyway, and I'll tell you what,
I'll tell you, it's rough pushing that clay through a screen. Oh
my God, I've got some stories. I'll tell you what, Vermont, you didn't push it through the screen. You just kind of like sliced it into very thin slices and chucked it. However, working on the coastal plain in North and South Carolina, you could dig 80-meter deep shovel tests in a day. So, I mean, it's just sand. But anyway, all right. So we'll cover the other parts of Chris's multi-part question, which will likely take us to the end of the show and into a part two after a promo from another great podcast from the Archaeology Podcast Network. Back in a minute.
Profiles in CRM, a weekly podcast. Ask CRM professionals 8 simple questions. The first questions establish education, location, and experience. The last questions are a reflection of that experience, and the answers will surprise you. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/profiles. On that page, you can also request to be interviewed for the show. It only takes 20 minutes, and you don't need any special equipment. Let's get back to the show.
All right, we're back, and I want to ask you, Dan, something about relating to what you mentioned earlier about GPR being expensive and training aspects, and this is related to excavation, and ground penetrating radar and other geophysical methods can at least tell you what's not there versus what is there. And to me, as a business owner, that seems like, I don't know, that seems like something that would be a pretty valuable piece of information if you can trust it and you can rely on it and you trust the people that are doing it to interpret the results correctly. It seems to me that hiring somebody like you to do this would be way cheaper than digging 20 or 30 negative cubic meters of excavation just to determine that there's nothing there. So how much of your time is really spent dealing with that sort of question and just talking to people and saying, listen, this is worth it. Trust me. It will save you a lot of time, energy, and money in the future.
It happens all the time. I mean, it's weekly, right? They have to sort of explain to people the benefit of this, and part of the issue is giving them confidence in the accuracy of the equipment, right? Giving them confidence in it's going to be able to tell us what we want it to, if we carry the survey out correctly, and that overall you're actually not only going to save money, but you're going to have a much denser data set than if you did 30 cubic meters of excavation. And so I deal with this all the time, not just in archaeology, but in other areas. And I had a conversation the other week with somebody who's this civil and geotechnical engineering. And so a lot of times, before they do design and they have to figure out how much rock they got to pull out in order to flatten the landscape, they have somebody come in. Not geophysics, and they come in and they borehole, and they might do 30 boreholes, right, to see the depth of the bedrock, okay, and that's going to sort of drive how they're going to deal with this. Right. And so I'll get into archaeology in a second, but just as an example, right, on the flip side, for a fraction of the cost, I can cover much more than 30 pinpoints of space and give you a three-dimensional model of the bedrock. And then we can bring in, like I was talking about before you went to break, then we can bring in the traditional methods, but they may only need to do 3 or 4 boreholes,
right?
Get a much denser data set with the geophysics, still be able to evaluate the rippability of the bedrock and what the costs are going to be. And actually, instead of filling in all the rest of the space between these 30 pinpoints, they have it all filled in with remotely sensed data, and then sort of just confirm with a borehole. So in the case for archaeology, right, you can, absolutely tell in many cases, where to save your time. So, where should you not spend your time excavating? Excavating is very costly. And if you can do what you can to limit, where you excavate or the resources you're going to, put towards excavation, if you can, just sort of streamline it and be efficient and excavate in places that are more likely to produce something, then I think you should do it. And so not only that, but a lot of times geophysics can provide like a safety net, because you'll be on a site, especially in urban areas, and you might be on a site that has utilities running across it. And, shovel into a utility, and that, utility goes down and people lose power and somebody could potentially get hurt. Even if you have a plat beforehand with a drawing on it where the utility was, those things are often wrong. And having geophysics conducted beforehand will say, look, don't dig here, there's a pipe or there's a utility. And so I think it's very helpful in those situations as well. It increases safety on the site, and then ultimately, right, reduces the cost for the client, because you're able to map the entire site in some cases, and then still do some excavation, but it's really targeted.
Nice. Dan, you've covered some really good points about like the strengths and weaknesses of geophysics. My question now is, the public seems to have increased skepticism of geophysics as perhaps a bad science. So what is the place of geophysics in like a public science, and how do you overcome bad science?
It's a great question. And I think everybody needs to do their part in engaging with the public and explaining the benefits of geophysics and also the limitations of it. And unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is people carry out geophysical survey or archaeological geophysical survey who aren't trained in geophysics necessarily. Often it happens they're not archaeologists, and it's tough talking to them about what they're doing because they look at it from some other perspective as opposed to archaeology. But they're untrained, not archaeologists, carry out an archaeological geophysical survey. It quote unquote doesn't work, and then people say, well, the technique doesn't work. In reality, training needs to be better. It needs to be more universal, and we need to do a better job of explaining the limitations of it to people, so they understand what it can and can't do. It can do a lot, and I have yet to see a project that geophysics offers 0 additional information. I have not seen a project. It does not always offer the information that you set out to get, but I have yet to see a project that geophysics offered 0 information. It is always, to me, given some level of information that's useful for the project, that's useful for the cultural resource project, that's useful for understanding human behavior, whether it's anthropological, archaeology, in an academic sense, whether it's useful for historic preservation. I've yet to see a project that no initial, that no additional data has come out of. But people don't recognize that, right? People look at, well, if it doesn't work on this project, it doesn't work. Well, rather, it might not work in this condition. The person might have used, let's say for GPR, for example, the wrong antenna. They may have interpreted the results incorrectly. They may not have been trained. And then that gets fed into the public sort of mind as, right, it's bad science. It doesn't work. I had a committee member who was an actual geophysicist, right? I mean, I don't run around claiming I'm a geophysicist. I'm an archaeologist and I'm a practitioner of geophysics, but I had a geophysicist on my committee. And a lot of times people will say, well, you didn't verify your GPR data, right? How do we know that that's a grave right there, right? How do we know that's some sort of buried structure right there, some sort of historic foundation, right? How do we actually know that? You haven't excavated, you haven't dug. Well, to that issue, my committee member said, and I'll never forget this, his name was Rob Hammond, he's in the geology department at UGA. He said something to the effect of, I use seismic technique, which is also a wave-based techniques. He goes, you use seismic techniques as a geophysicist to understand that the core of the Earth is molten. I will never be able to ground truth that, but we're pretty sure that the core of the Earth, right, is what it is. And and nobody disputes that, right? Nobody disputes that. Everyone recognizes that, look, if the wave travels like this and it comes across the middle of the Earth from an earthquake on the other side of the Earth and it gets recorded here, here's the speed that it should travel if the physical properties are this, are X. Well, that's exactly how far it traveled in that amount of time. So, right, by deduction, you should anticipate that. You can make the claim very strongly that it is there. We don't do that enough, I think, with the public for archaeology.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely
making them recognize that the data are the data, right? I mean, I'm not showing you that there's a buried feature. I'm showing you here's a reflection from a wave. It took this amount of time. Here's the geometry of it. Here's what you would expect based on simulations of what a grave reflection should produce if this was the condition of the grave. And guess what? That's what we saw. We've excavated many, many, many of these things after they've been located with GPR, and so we can, we can deduce that this is likely a grave, also. Not a guarantee, but it's likely a grave. And we don't, I think, take that approach, but we need to, right? And in part, that talks about then the limitations. Right? What do we actually see? Well, we don't see the grave, right? What we see is a reflection, and it has a certain geometry, and it has a certain signature, and we use that to make some sort of inference about what that feature actually is, right? What caused that reflection? But the more that we do it, and under the more circumstances and conditions that we do it in, we have a better and better and better baseline in order to make those interpretations. And so I think that that's what we all need to do better, because I think that it's almost not even a problem as far as geophysics is concerned or archaeology is concerned. I think it's a problem with understanding the philosophy of science. And, the unfortunately, the public, I don't think gets enough of that. They sort of get big headlines in the news, and that's sort of their science daily or, for the week or whatever. But rarely do we talk, sort of philosophy of science. And you don't have to do that, I think, deeply. I think you can get sort of some of those main points across, but I think that would help everybody in the world who does, has a scientific approach in dealing with the public.
That's a great answer, Dan. And the philosophy of science is such a huge point that I think the general public gets lost on, no matter what the science is, whether it's geophysics, archaeology, or even climate science. It's one of those things that just because they don't understand it doesn't mean it's magic. And also, like, there are debates in any field of science. That's just the nature of how we go about our science.
Look, you can take, I agree. And I think that you brought up a really important point, which is like, climate science, because it's such a hot topic, in the public eye, and whether or not there really is climate change or sort of, rapid, more rapid climate change because it's human induced. I think in part people reject it, and in part politicians reject it because, I don't know if they're viewing it through the correct lens. But to break it down, here's truth. This is truth. I'm going to tell you right now. You excavate a site in the southeast United States. I got to talk from the southeast because that's where basically my whole career is. In the southeast, you excavate a site. It's a Mississippian site, let's say, and you get post holes, right, that have remnants in, let's say, the Georgia red clay. You're going to get a post hole that's basically a stain of soil. Mm-hmm. Right? You guys follow me so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That stain of soil, let's say you excavate it out. There's no artifact in it. Okay, you excavate it out. Now, what's the archaeology? And you have a pattern of them, and they're, square with rounded corners, right? What's going to be the interpretation? Oh, it's a building, right? And that those stains are the, post holes, right? They're the the remnants of decayed organic material that once was a wooden post. Well, did we actually find that? No, we didn't. What we found was a soil stain, right? That's what it is. and we make an inference. But people have no problems not rejecting that soil stain pattern as representing a building.
Mm-hmm.
Geophysics really should be looked at in the same way, right?
Yeah.
In reality, what did you find? What are your data when you uncover it through excavation? Your data are a series of soil stains. That's what it is. But then we, by deduction, recognize that, well, there are chemical processes that that create a certain kind of organic material, after the wood decays, so on and so forth. And this is what our expectation is that's going to be left after 1,000 years. Okay, that's the process. For GPR, it's the same process, right? We don't see a post hole with the GPR, right? What we see is a reflection. Well, we might see a series of reflections that create a square with rounded corners, right? And we have an expectation of what that would look like with organic soil embedded in a clay matrix. So we can look at that and say, this is why, we believe, or we interpret it this way, because the reflection is, that is the data point right there, just like the organic soil is the data point if you excavated it. So in neither case do you actually see a building. In both cases, you're making an inference. But when you excavate it out, people say, oh, well, that's verification. It's not. What you found was a soil stain. And I could have told you there's going to be a soil stain because I saw it reflect, the GPR wave. So, it's the same process. And I think people don't recognize, what the data actually are, what the evidence actually are, and that in all of this, we're making inferences, but they're really substantiated inferences. And so with GPR, people, I think, can recognize that it's, there are physical laws here that are at play that aren't just going to randomly produce some sort of behavior with the wave just because, the Earth felt like it that day. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not going to happen. I mean, it happens because there are physical, properties at play, and the wave's going to behave in the way that waves behave, and that's what we're interpreting. And then we're making inferences based on that. So there are some limitations. However, we can make very good inferences, and the more that we use it, and the more context we use it, I think we can make more and more accurate inferences, based on just seeing those reflections, or seeing those, variations in the magnetic field, or seeing those, induced electric currents, for using like conductivity, or whatever the case may be.
All right, well, we're going to take our final break before we come back and wrap this up. And I'm glad you brought in some other methods, because that's what we're going to wrap this up with. We're going to talk about some of that and maybe some other things right after this break.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
Okay, we're back for our final segment, and Dan, you brought in some other geophysical methods right at the end of the last segment, and that's kind of what I want to talk about next. We're not going to go into those as heavily as we did GPR, but to sort of lead into those, I want to ask you, when a client comes to you and says, we need geophysical, XYZ done over here, how do you decide what needs to be done? What sort of method needs to be used? Is it solely based on what they think is there, like as if it graves and stuff like that, or is it based on the soil, or what helps you decide what geophysical methods you're going to use?
All of what you said, So the more information we have prior to survey, the better we're going to be able to strategize for the survey, and the less information we have, the more difficult it is. So the any prior information is going to be helpful. If it's an archaeological site that has reports written up on it already, we have some anticipation of of what are expected to be found. That's very helpful. Geological conditions are going to influence what we use, and then certainly the budget of the project is going to dictate what we use. A lot of times, I encourage clients to use multiple methods, because each method gives you, it maps a different physical property of the soil. And so, most studies have shown when you do multiple methods that some features are going to show up in all 2 or 3 methods that you use. But you might get some features that only show up with magnetometer, and you might get some features that only showing up with, ground penetrating radar. So we encourage it, but we're sometimes limited, by those factors. So the strategy is usually based on prior information, geological conditions, goals of the survey, right? Goals of the survey,
right?
And we use all that, and budget, and then we use all that to create a strategy. So, for example, just to take 20 seconds. If I'm working with an academic institution and they want to evaluate a mound, again, and they're on a limited budget, and they want to know kind of how many stages was the mound constructed in, like a Mississippian mound or Woodland mound or something like that. The goals of that survey are going to dictate something like GPR, and then possibly, if they can afford it, something like electrical resistivity. But if you have a shallow site that has a lot of organic material, like in post holes or hearths or other kinds of refuse pits, then maybe a magnetometer is going to be the better technique, right? You're going to be able to cover it maybe faster than with the GPR, and it might identify those targets possibly with better precision as well.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. What is the I'm trying to think of how to ask this question. I'm wondering about size. Like at what point, let's say, for example, I've done a lot of work in the Southeast, and, we'll have a project where, they tell us to go out and do shovel tests across 1,500 acres, something like that. I'm wondering I guess budget would be the only real limiting factor, but for most CRM firms or even academic institutions, what kind of size of project do you think would be the average that you would do? You would do this on? Again, like you said, budget is usually a limiting factor, but in your experience, are we talking several hundred square meters, or are we talking a couple acres or something like that? Or, what kind of size of projects do you guys usually do?
I tend to do projects anywhere from, some are very small. Some might be like a 30 meter by 30 meter, would be a very small project, up to sometimes 10 or 15 acres. And I've done some. So for my dissertation project, on the other hand, right, it was up to almost 40 acres, right. So it was about 15 or 16 hectares that we covered. But it's doable on very large scale. So now. A lot of that has to do with budget, because the instrumentation they're coming out with, you can hook into a four-wheeler and drag it and put a GPS right on the instrument and just go around, right? And so you can cover hundreds and hundreds of acres pretty quickly with that equipment. The problem is, right, in this case, literally is budget. A piece of equipment like that, a multi-channel GPR that might have like 12 channels or something, so basically it has 12 antennas that are collecting at the same time, and then with a GPS that is accurate enough, let's say within like 10 centimeters, to be carrying something like that out, that GPR is going to be $150,000. So it's very expensive. You also need the four-wheeler. You also need the GPS, and some people are able to do that, and some firms even in North America, for example, do that with the magnetometer. So they put 10 channels on the back of a golf cart or a gator or something like that.
Yeah.
And they can roll around pretty quickly sites by having it logged into a GPS, collecting GPS units in real time. So you can do very, very, very large surveys, but there's a major cost, right, to something like that. But I would say more frequently, things are numbering in the single digits or 2-digit acres, certainly for things like GPR, especially when it comes to things like CRM, right? It's much more rare that you're going to get a 1,500 acre project that you're going to do GPR over, especially if there's all sorts of obstructions, right, along 1,500 acres. So they're usually not that size, based on logistics, based on budget, but it is doable. And I would say in the future, that kind of thing is going to be more and more and more doable, and people are going to are going to do large scale geophysical survey, because they're going to stick a 12 channel GPR antenna on the front, a 10 channel magnetometer on the back, have a centimeter precision, brand new Trimble GPS on it. They're going to all around, and it's going to be an amazing, system. And as prices come down, which they tend to do, we'll see the implementation of that more and more. But I don't generally do that. I haven't found any CRM projects that have done that with geophysics on that kind of scale. They generally tend to be, in the single digits or 10 or 20 acres is what I've encountered.
Probably when they get down to the like the phase 2, quote unquote phase 2 stage, when they're down to site testing, I would say a lot of CRM projects would probably request those sorts of services.
Yeah, I think that's the stage that it can benefit.
Yeah.
Right. So when you get to stage 2, phase 2, you sort of you cover 1,500 acres. You find a series of areas that actually had positives, and you go in and now you're going to start exposing more. You're going to be doing some test pits or whatever the case may be.
Right.
But if, let's say, in this 1,500 acre project, you have 10 different sites that you've located. Each site could be covered potentially pretty quick, assuming it's not some major town, Mississippian town or major town in the Southwest or something like that. If we're talking pre-contact or whatever, you can cover those sites pretty rapidly with geophysics. And again, even if you can't see the exact outlines of architecture, a lot of times you're able to tell site size, which is an important indicator without excavating, and you can tell a number of other things like, as related to, Section 106, what's the condition of the site. A lot of times geophysics, especially GPR, can give you some sense of the conditions of the subsurface. So whether it's not, it can be nominated or not, in part is going to have to do with, what condition the site is in, and GPR can certainly detect, subsurface problems. You can detect how much disturbance has occurred, through tree root disturbance and things like that very rapidly, right? And so in those situations, I think that it's a major benefit to come in with geophysics and ground penetrating radar, potentially prior to shovel testing or doing excavation pits.
Right. So we're talking about major benefit, but really what we mean here is it makes it cheaper in the long run. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So let's in the last 6-7 minutes here, let's talk about that. What does cheaper actually mean? What does a typical geophysical survey cost? In terms of the rate for doing this, and then people who are listening to this that know how much shovel testing costs, for example, can equate that to their own costs, because every company has slightly different costs, I'm sure, and depending on what region you're in. So what does a typical geophysical survey typically cost?
So the way that my rates are, just to put it out there, and this ranges. It ranges. I think across the country, it ranges. Depending on the firm, it ranges depending on who's carrying out the survey. So the rate that I generally charge is $1,500 per day. But I've seen that range. Generally the range is between about $1,000 and $2,000 per day is what I've encountered. Some people will offer it for much less than $1,000. And I tell my clients, and when they say, well, somebody else is, half your price, I say, well, make sure that you budget in for when you actually hit the grave, because probably will. And then others have higher rates than that. Some people I've seen up to $2,500. So I'm somewhere in the middle. But I think that we're reasonably priced, but I think that we're priced really well for the service that we provide and the experience that I bring, to the projects. But that's what it is. And so how much can you cover in a day, right? So what does $1,500 a day translate into?
Right.
And you can generally cover, at least this is what I have found, 1 to 2 acres a day. And there's generally 1 to 2 days of data processing, analyzing, and writing associated with every day in the field.
Okay.
So 1 to 2 acres may run somewhere between $3,000 to $4,500. But then again, don't forget let's say you're using GPR. It's a very high resolution data set that can potentially be 3-dimensional. That you can guide excavations with, or not. Right? You might be able to say, look, for $4,500, don't dig here, as opposed to putting in a number of pits that would take time and money too.
Right. Okay. Well, we've only got a couple minutes left. What you mentioned during the pre-show using cadaver dogs, and would you consider that a geophysical method?
Well, I mean, it's sort of it's a biochemical method,
Right.
I think technically, but it's certainly remote sensing, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, for
it's
sure.
absolutely remote sensing. It's a non-invasive remote sensing, and the dogs smell human remains scent. So I've had to actually get versed, okay, in a whole new series of language with these, and they're not even cadaver dogs, right? So my expert that I brought in was like, they're actually human remains detection dogs, or HRD dogs. So which has been kind of a cool learning process too, for me. But that's for sure a non-invasive, remotely sensed technique. And the success that I had with it at Kettle Creek Battlefield, which is a Revolutionary War battlefield, was excellent. It was really good success. So, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it, and we're looking to try to bring them back to cover more space, right? I mean, it worked so well in the pilot study at Kettle Creek Battlefield that we want to cover the entire battlefield with the dogs now.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're gonna kill this podcast right here. We can have Dan on to talk about some other geophysical methods later on, because I think as archaeologists we could talk about this all day long. And we could spend a whole episode on probably magnetometry, resistivity, all that other stuff. So and we could bring that in, and we will likely do that. For those of you that like to shut the podcast off at this point, I encourage you not to. First off, always listen to my show notes or my credits. Damn it, they're valuable. I know people, including my wife, who shut podcasts off right before the credits. That being said, we're gonna have another segment right after this that's gonna have some pretty awesome information. So keep listening, and we're gonna kill it right here. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it, and thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate your attention. I know it's your time, but thank you so much.
Absolutely, and we will talk to you next time. Hey everyone, I'm here with Dan Bigman of Bigman Geophysical with an awesome special offer for APN listeners. Dan, what have you got for us?
Well, for the past year, I've been everywhere I've went. People have requested training on ground penetrating radar, and they've all voiced concerns that there's nowhere to get accessible quality training for a really reasonable price. So what Bigman Geophysical is doing is we're going to put on a 3-part webinar series on GPR basics, ground penetrating radar basics. That's going to take place Mondays, April 18th, April 25th, and May 2nd, 2016. In this course, we're going to break it into 3 parts. Part 1 is going to go over basic concepts and theory of ground penetrating radar. Part 2 is going to talk about processing data, visualizing data, and GPR data interpretation. And then part 3 is going to be all about case studies and applications of ground penetrating radar to several different industries, including archaeology.
And how long does each class period last?
So each class period is going to have a live section on Monday. For each of those Mondays, it's going to be about an hour and 15 to an hour and a half of class time. And then there's going to be additional time for question and answers throughout each course. What we're also going to do is do an unlimited replay for each topic for each week from Wednesday to Sunday. So if you miss it or you want to see it again, which we hope you do, then you'll be able to log into a special website and replay the webinar.
And how much is this going to cost us?
So the regular price of this webinar is $299. And what we're going to do for APN listeners as a special deal is give a 25% discount for the first 7 days that we're running registration. So that's going to go from March 7th till March 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern time for that 25% discount. After that, we're still going to give APN listeners a discount that's just for them. It's going to be 10%. But if you really want to get in this for relatively inexpensive, then the 25% off is going to give you a rate of $225 for the course.
So where can people go to sign up for this class?
You just have to pop over to bigmangeophysical.com/APN to get the special rate. That's BIGMANGEOPHYSICAL.com/APN. And there they can sign up and go to a secure website to enter all their information and get that 25% off.
So whether you're a seasoned archaeologist or just getting started, this course will really be an asset for everyone. Head over to bigmangeophysical.com/APN, or you can click through from the APN website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com to get your 25% off today. That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArchPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.